Welcome back. This time we're talking about Person of Interest, Season 5, Episode 13, Return Zero, the series finale. The ending to the journey that began 5 seasons ago when Harold Finch offered John Reese a job. Well, this was an episode filled with action and emotion, laughs and tears, as we get to see the results of Finch unleashing the Ice-9 virus on Samaritan. And this ultimately leads to the final showdown between the Machine and Samaritan. And of course this episode has one final casualty. John, who survived the previous 102 episodes, finally meets a situation he can't escape, but it's also a situation that he put himself in order to save Harold. This is also an episode where we finally get to see the bookend on the opening voiceover in the season premiere, where we heard Root's voice talking to some unknown person. And finally, we get a glimpse of where our surviving characters will be heading in a post-Samaritan world, although not necessarily a post-Machine world. Now, I have to say, this was a really satisfying series finale, especially when you consider that the creators had planned a 2-season third act to this story that would have played out over 44 episodes had CBS not first shortened this season and then ultimately canceled. So instead of 44 episodes, they had 13. And although there's been a few cracks along the way where we've seen how a full 22 episode order would have helped kind of spread this story out a little bit, this really is a satisfying conclusion to the journey that we've been on since the very first episode. Now, before we get into the actual events of this episode, there is something I would like to touch on, and that is the Ice-9 virus. Ever since it was introduced at the end of episode 10, I have been critical of this plot device. Now, I still think it came into the story a little too late and a little too conveniently. I do have to say, I had kind of an epiphany as I was rewatching the final few minutes of episode 12.exe just before beginning the series finale. And that has to do with Root, and specifically why Finch turned to this option when he did. And this really is a twofold answer. First, the more obvious one, at least to me as I've been making these complaints about this plot device, is that this is the point after Root was killed that Finch was fed up, as we saw in that scene in the holding cell where he directed his comments to Samaritan itself about how he was not going to allow any more of his friends to die, while he was trying to play within his rules and find a solution that didn't involve so much collateral damage and ultimately the death of his machine. And of course they could have played that earlier, had some other catalyst that's at least had him mention this Ice-9 virus. But that leads me to the second part of my answer, and really what was my epiphany in the moments before hitting play on this episode. And it's honestly something I probably should have thought of earlier, and maybe you all did before I did. But really, with Root, I don't see Finch going to this option while she was alive, because this essentially would mean he was killing not only his creation, but her god. And I don't think that she would have allowed him to do that. And she was fighting this whole season to arm the machine to make it more capable for this fight against Samaritan. And ultimately Finch decides to go with the nuclear option and pretty much kill everybody. Whether or not they could have won going the other direction, we'll never know. Story, it makes more sense to me now why he did what he did when he did. That's a lot of dids. I still think it's a little late from a storytelling perspective to introduce this plot device, but within the story it makes more sense to me, and my complaints are lessened because of it. I'm still not sure, however, why Samaritan allowed it to exist in the first place, but that's just something I'm going to have to live with, because this finale itself was just, it was an amazing hour of television. The dialogue, to the acting, to the cinematography, to the action, everything, it was a beautiful episode, as beautiful as you can be when one of your favorite characters dies during it. So normally I rewatch the entire episode before I do this video, and I actually got about 3 or 4 minutes into it and started taking notes, and before I knew it, I was done. I had written like 6 pages of notes, and we're going to be getting through all of that, so I'm sure you've already seen the counter. I'm betting this is going to be a long video. But rewatching that opening scene, where we see the still images and then going to black, and then hearing Root's voiceover from the beginning of the season, and it's obvious upon rewatching it that we're now seeing the machine speaking to its new version, the one that's just waking up, having returned from the satellite. Now I have to say, after watching .exe, I had pretty much realized that now that the machine had Root's voice, that the voiceover was going to be the machine speaking to somebody, but I didn't know who. And I have to say, the idea of the machine using an analog audio recorder to record a message to its future self, if it did indeed survive its battle with Samaritan in the satellite, was just simply brilliant writing. That was amazing. I mean, as I said, you kind of knew going in that that voiceover was the machine, but who exactly it was talking to, I would never have guessed what ultimately it was, and it was both just, as I said, amazing writing and incredibly poignant for how we've seen the machine evolve in this season. Which leads me to my next point. This entire season has been about the machine. One thing I love about Person of Interest, and I've mentioned it before, is its ability to give its characters wonderful arcs. Whether it's Finch, John, Carter, Fosco, Elias, Shaw, Root, every primary character has gotten an amazing arc. They are not in the same place they were when they were first introduced, some drastically so. But this season was when we got to see that arc for the machine. Unknowingly, we've been seeing it all along, but we weren't able to see it because we weren't able to hear the machine speak for itself. And thus, with the system being more open for the majority of this season, we've been able to get a better idea of how the machine sees the world. A often referred to episode by myself from last season, If Then Else, was our first real glimpse of how the machine sees the world and sees these simulations as it tries to figure out the best course of action and how to save human lives. And as we saw earlier in this season, that took a actual emotional toll on the machine, because to save a life, it had to see that life end hundreds, if not thousands of times as it played out these scenarios to figure out a way to create a path in which that life was saved. And in this episode, that builds on that in 2 ways. One, in that it had to experience death through watching people die and how they react and how others react, to understand just how to save people, to truly predict what people were going to do in these situations. It had to experience it. And doing that caused it grief. And as it explains to Finch, it had to learn that on itself because he did not teach it how to do that. And it's just, again, the dialogue from, a sentient AI is better than half the dialogue we get on any other television series out there right now. I'm so going to miss Person of Interest, and it's because of the writing and the characters and how they're able to use character and dialogue to create such great scenes, not to mention all the action and everything else. But the fact that the machine is essentially the main character of this season, and it works beautifully, just goes to show how strong the writing is on the show. Of course, this leads to the very poignant conversation between the machine and Finch on the rooftop as they're discussing death and how it apparently discovered a meaning to it all and then promptly forgot it, which led to a bit of comic relief there. And this was a pretty heavy episode, but there were some pretty funny moments. Finch's lament that its discovery was morbid, and then also his lament that it forgot the meaning of life, as well as John's line when he and Finch are breaking into the reserve, and Finch uses the fake nuclear device, and John just looks over at him and goes, "I like this new you." And that's another one of these arcs that really could have gotten a more breadth to it in a longer season, but we can't continue to lament on what we're not going to have. So we do have these moments, and it was nice that they were able to again fill in these comedic moments in an otherwise serious episode. And that's another thing that this show has always been really good at, is having those comic relief moments but never making it feel gimmicky. Structurally, this episode really plays with time. A lot of flash forwards, flashbacks, not really a linear telling of obviously, and on pretty much most levels that it works really well, especially considering they tie it into the machine losing its core functions and once again losing its grip on time. Possibly the saddest moment in the entire episode was when the machine was questioning Finch at the beginning about, is this now? And it's just, I don't know, there's just something about that line that was just so powerful. And not to harp on it, but again, the dialogue in this show, whether it's just emotional conversations between characters or profound philosophical discussions, they nail it on both counts, and this episode especially has examples of both in great fashion. They do use this non-linear storytelling to do some overt foreshadowing to really keep us guessing on who, if any of our characters, are the one is going to ultimately pay the price in this episode and not survive. The specific example would be, we got a quick glimpse of Fosco bleeding on the subway car. And that kind of overt foreshadowing can work, and for the most part it does in this episode, but it also sort of annoyed me in that when we were having the moments, the final moment between Fosco and John, before the team splits up, and the whole time with Fosco and Shaw on the train car, I'm waiting for him to get shot or stabbed, and it kind of detracted from some scenes that it really didn't need to detract from. That being said, the show has always been good about misdirection. Prior to these last few episodes, the first time we lost a major character was when Carter was killed. And that was over a multi-episode arc as they wrapped up the HR storyline. And the marketing, which I don't blame on the writers, pretty much told us someone was going to die. But over the course of those episodes, the writers did a really good job of every main character had a moment where I legitimately thought they weren't going to survive, because we knew someone wasn't going to. And they did a really good job in that. And ultimately, it was Carter that didn't survive. But as I said, it could have gone any direction. In this episode, maybe not on that degree, but they did a good job of having those moments where you really weren't sure what was going to happen. And ultimately, as we know, it was John that died, and of course we have to jump into that now. Really, the majority of the second half of this season has been about Finch and his guilt over creating the machine, as well as the price that his friends are paying in this war against Samaritan. Of course, that is what ultimately leads him to going the Ice-9 route, even though the collateral damage is so high. But that also led us to know, or led me to know, that whatever the end game was, he was going to put himself in the position that he was the one that was going to pay the final sacrifice if one was necessary. And of course, that's what he tries to do in this episode. So of course, John had to come in at the last moment and save him one last time. And I have to say, it's especially touching the fact that he was able to make this deal with the machine in order to save Finch, and the machine went along with it. Now, as I said, this wasn't quite like the Carter arc, where anyone could have died, and anyone could have, but as the episode kind of got into motion, it was pretty obvious that if someone was not going to make it, it was either going to be John or Finch. And I have to say, personally, I went into this episode really, really hoping that John was going to survive, because I really felt if anyone was going to die, not knowing what was going to happen in this episode, that John had a good chance of not surviving, as well as Finch. I thought those were the two most likely to not make it. And I was really, not that I wanted Finch to die, because I didn't, but I really hoped John wasn't going to die. Because a lot of his storyline through the entire series, and as we touched on earlier in this season when he broke up with his girlfriend, that he has had this feeling that he doesn't deserve this normal, happy life. And it's not just that he can't have it because of the situations he puts himself in, but there's been times where he feels he doesn't deserve it. And that healing has been slow, and as we've seen, has not been complete, with his actions breaking up his relationship at the start of the season. So I really hoped that he was going to be able to have a chance to reach a point where he felt he deserved that and ultimately get it, allow himself to have it. So when he first showed up on the other roof and I realized what was happening, I was upset. I really was. I didn't want Finch to die, but I kind of accepted it. I kind of got myself in a point that I understood where Finch was coming from, I understood his motivations, and he seemed at peace with it. So I almost felt cheated when I saw John there on the roof. But then he had this conversation with Finch, and they're talking, and he's talking about how he made the deal with the machine and how he wanted to save his friend's life. And although he doesn't come out and say it because it wouldn't make sense for him to overtly say it, you realize that he's not doing it because he doesn't feel he deserves a happy future. He's doing it because he's willing to give up that future to save his friend. And that the machine understood that and allowed him to make that choice is just doubly powerful. It ultimately honored his free will in making that choice. And in one action, validates his decision, but also, once again, one final time, shows us the difference between the machine and Samaritan. So, as much as it hurts to see John die at this juncture, at the final moments before the war is over, they made me buy it. I understood it. It felt true. And as sad as it is, it works for this episode and this series and the characters involved. Now, with like a lot of series finales, some story arcs get more play than others. Obviously, the key characters of this episode were John, Finch, and the Machine, which did not leave as much time for Fosco and Shaw. Now, in the case of Fosco, we got to see him, have some good action, as well as letting him finally see the Machine in person. And his reaction is just pure, perfect Fosco. As for Shaw, like Fosco, she didn't get quite as much screen time as some of the others, but I have to say the writers and Sarah Shahi made the most of it. Whether it was her in the graveyard, seeing that Root's grave had been desecrated, and that's a pretty dark image if you want to think about the fact that they basically dug up Root's body to get to her cochlear implant. I'm not even going to touch that. Let's just move on. But we got to see Shaw react to the Machine using Root's voice, as well as giving her a chance to avenge Root's death and killing Jeff Blackwell. And mentioning Jeff Blackwell, I have to say, he's a character that probably could have, again, been better served with a longer final season, but it was an interesting arc, although condensed, to see him go from a kind of an unwilling errand boy to a willing soldier over the course of this final season, and his work with Samaritan and how it darkly mirrored how our characters were bettered by their interactions with the Machine, while his interactions with Samaritan led him to become a killer and ultimately die at the hands of a very mad Shaw. Now, before I get to the end and talking about where our characters are ultimately at the point of the end of this series, I do want to mention a few things that kind of got left out in this season. And these are things I just guess the writers couldn't fit into this 13 episode final season. We never got to see Zoe again. That's a little disappointing. We never did find out what happened to Root's helpers. They all got their own servers at the same time our heroes did, but we never saw them again. I have to wonder if they became another team with the machine now that we know that there are multiple teams out there. And perhaps most disappointing of all was that we never got to see what happened to Control. I really think that they did not plan on her being dead at the end of last season. I really think she was going to come back in some capacity. They just couldn't make it work in the time frame that they had available to them. But getting back to what we did get in this episode and where our characters are left when we get these final credits, we see Finch finally willing to reveal himself to Grace. I think he's doing that partly because John gave his life to allow him to have his own life, and to not live it to its fullest would be, kind of a mark against that sacrifice. So I like the idea that Finch can hopefully have a happy future. I have to believe that sooner or later the new version of the machine will contact him, or he will learn of its existence. But I hope at that point in his life that he'll realize that he can have a life with Grace and still, if he wants, interact with the machine and its mission. You see Fosco, he's still on the force, he's still a cop. We never did get to see his son show back up again, but I do have to kind of wonder how he explained away what happened to his captain, as well as all the crooked cops that got shot on the shoreline. But I'm willing to let that go because I'd like to see Fosco have a good future as well. Shaw's around as well. She's apparently staying in New York. I'm not sure what she had planned after getting her revenge against Jeff Blackwell, but she did take the time to go get Bear, and whatever she was planning obviously is going to be put on hold when she gets a phone call from the new machine. And of course we don't get to hear what was said on the phone, whether it was numbers or if it was Root's voice. Obviously this is a newborn machine, but it was being taught through the audio recordings from the previous machine, which was kind of Machine 2.0. And that was basically condensed down to a very small briefcase. How much of its memories and awareness was able to be transferred from those small amount of chips that were still in the briefcase to the satellite is not revealed. But I'd like to think that it was able to retain its memories, or at least be taught its memories, or enough of it to have the awareness and the insights in humanity that it had learned in its previous incarnation. So of course this does leave us with questions. Does Shaw start saving numbers again? Does she enlist Fosco's help? Does Finch ever find out about this? What about the relevant numbers? Is it going to secretly send information to the government like it did before when it was quasi on its payroll? So in a way this is a bit of an open-ended conclusion, but not one that is trying to beg for a spin-off or a sequel series. I really feel like this is a satisfying conclusion, but that doesn't mean it has to be the end. I mean, these are characters who are going to continue living lives in this world that has been created by these writers over the course of 103 episodes. So to feel like it was like everything's over and it's done was never really going to be an option. So I really like the way they set the tone for these final moments, where some storylines are complete. John, obviously, Finch putting aside his guilt and his fears, like John had, that he wasn't able to have a normal life, have normal relationships, and you can see that he's growing and accepting that he might be able to actually have what he wants. And honestly, because he is a good guy, even though he might argue that, he deserves that life. And then we get to see Shaw and Fosco. I mean, they're characters who are good people. It took a little while to get there, but they're good people and they genuinely want to help people. And I can see them working together to continue the mission of the machine, which is to help and save humanity. Now, I wish the show had not been canceled. I wish we could have seen more, but I think even if we'd gotten the 44 episodes that they wanted, I think we would have ended up in a pretty similar spot. This is how the show was destined to end. And I'm fine with that. In that I'm satisfied with the story. I'm satisfied with the potential, even if we never see it, that these characters are out there continuing to live their lives. And that's the best kind of finale you can have, really. And I have to say, given the constraints, given just the shoddy way CBS has handled this series, cutting its order, delaying the release of this season, and then more or less dumping the episodes in a haphazard fashion, I think the quality and integrity of the show shone through. And I'm just thankful that when I first saw the commercials for the series premiere that I took the time to watch this show, and I've watched every episode since. And I can honestly say that this has been my favorite show on television since it aired. It has consistently gotten better. Season 2 was better than Season 1. Season 3 was better than Season 2. Season 4 was better than Season 3. I'm not sure because of the time constraints that I can say the same thing about Season 5, but that in no way means that it was not a good season and that this was not an excellent season finale and a series finale. I do hope that you've enjoyed these videos. I hope you've enjoyed me rambling on about this show. I've enjoyed talking about it. It gives me a chance to, just talk about my favorite show. So with that, with a heavy heart, I have to say that this is the end. This is the end of Person of Interest and the end of my reviews. I'm sure I can always come up with something else to talk about, but whether that happens or not, I don't know now. But again, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. So until I find another show to watch that I just feel compelled to talk about, know the machine is watching.